Welcome to Reels on the Rocks, the show where your hosts Whiskey and Sweet Tea discuss film from the unpretentious perspective. This month we're discussing the work of the flying Farrelly Brothers, beginning today with Dumb and Dumber. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and as always, please be advised that spoilers are ahead.
Mock.
C.
Ing.
C.
Bird.
C.
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 Mockingbird, don't you heard? I don't know the song. Welcome
C.
back to Reels on the Rocks. So if you're reading the title, obviously you know which film we're talking about, and for this month, which should be March, we are doing a couple of Farrelly films, which is sort of, I was saying this, I'm pretty sure they're actually Irish American, so even though we're not doing like a, St. Patty's Day thing, it's kind of an appropriate thing to do. Also love that we're doing two comedies because the world is pretty depressing right now.
The world needs some comedy.
For sure. If you guys are tuning in and you need to take a break from the madness going on in the world, we're here for it. So,
and if you're in the Ukraine, you have our love and support, and hopefully we can make you laugh for an hour.
Yeah. And hello. I don't know if we have any listeners.
We have listeners from all over the world, so it's entirely possible.
I know. You've told me. I just don't know if they were from Ukraine. But anyway. So before we get into the film, I will be drinking for this episode a brew called Prankster with a Q. It's a Belgian-style golden ale from North Coast Brewing Company, and it's supposed to be an IPA, which I might not be a fan of, but we'll check it out. I just thought Prankster sounded about appropriate for this film. So, and for both of these, reviews, I will be doing beer for this month because I feel like beer is kind of a good comedy combination. Like, I feel like if you're sitting back and laughing at something, you're probably drinking something a little bit more laid back.
You and I are of the same mind, except I don't like, normal beer. So I'm having cider. For this one, nice. I'm having Austin East ciders. It's one of my favorite ciders. Very relaxing, very laid back. I have mine currently in the flavor of, what does this say? Pineapple. I just thought that fit, and I was like, especially because it's all they drink in that movie. Get the essentials, and they come back, with some cases of, I don't think it was Budweiser, but of something.
I just remember I think the only time I've drunk cider on this show, I think it was for our Dogville review because of the whole apple orchard thing in that movie.
Yes.
So, throwback to that episode. But anyway,
and we're sorry if you had to sit through that movie. We apologize. I'm just kidding.
Hey, I liked it. It's not a happy movie, but spoiler alert if you haven't heard that episode. I liked it. But anyway, so going into this film, as I said, if you can read the title, we're talking about Dumb and Dumber, the 1994 classic from the Farrelly Brothers.
Yes.
And I, before we were
Can we call them the Flying Farrelly Brothers? That just sounds cooler.
They do sound like a circus act when you put it like that. But so, before we were, when we were deciding which film would go first and stuff, I said we should do this one first, partly because this is their directorial debut. This was their first film.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's it kind of, and the film we'll be reviewing next time is actually the film they followed up this film with. So we're talking this month about their beginnings in Hollywood, their first two films. And they would go on to do other hits, like There's Something About Mary. I feel like if you haven't seen it, T, you'd probably like Shallow.
Yeah.
And they would also, I actually made a list because it's crazy the stuff that they would go on to do. They did stuff like, so some of them you might even already know. They did stuff like Me, Myself, and Irene, Shallow Hal, Stuck on You, Fever Pitch. The one that I did not realize they directed was Osmosis Jones.
Wait, they did Fever Pitch?
They did Fever Pitch.
The one with oh god, it's Drew
Drew
Barrymore
Barrymore.
and what was the guy? I forget his name now. Oh,
Not
Jimmy Fallon. Was that Jimmy Fallon?
not only did they do Fever Pitch, but because that actually came out the year the Red Sox finally won the World Series after like 80 years, they had to reshoot the ending because they were expecting them not to win. So after they won the World Series, they're like, "Oh, we got to change the ending because this is the year that they won." So
Fun
that
fact
was the whole
about that
thing.
movie: my older brother, that was the first movie he took a girl on a date to.
Good choice. I didn't see it, but I mean, I hear it's good. It's more of a rom com, so not really my thing. But I heard it's good. And they did that one because they are big Red Sox fans.
Are they
So
from Boston?
no, they're actually from Pennsylvania, which I was going to bring up in the next review, which I will bring up in the next review. So this obviously is a massive, massive hit. I would go as far as to say this is like a classic comedy, especially at this point. The budget was $17 million, and it grossed 127 million in the U.S. and 247 million worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Came out in December 16th, 1994, directed by Peter Farrelly and his brother Bobby, although uncredited. And it
Yeah,
was written by them and their writing partner, Bennett Yellen, or Benny Yellen as they call him.
Benny.
Uh, the other reason I picked this one was because last year we reviewed Yes Man, and you had mentioned that you hadn't really seen any Jim Carrey films. And I
Right.
was like, wait, really? You hadn't seen The Mask? You hadn't seen Dumb and Dumber, Ace Ventura, any of these, Liar Liar that like he was famous for? And so I kept that in the back of my brain. I was like, I need to have a review of something, one of his like more famous movies that he did in the 90s, since you hadn't seen any. So, with that being said, I've got plenty of fun facts here to talk about, but just right off the bat, what did you think, T?
It was not my cup of tea, but
Really?
but it wasn't bad. Like, I'm not gonna say it's because it was bad. It's just it wasn't my type of humor. There were certainly some humorous moments, but there was a lot of it that I was just like, I mean, and maybe this is again, and we've talked about this before, where it's not necessarily the film's fault. It's that maybe this is the originator of this type of like humor in a mainstream audience, in a mainstream release or something. But a lot of it seemed a little dated. Again, not its fault. And I'm not saying like it was trying to be. So I just feel like the humor style was very 90s, if that makes sense.
No, going back to this one, it was nice seeing, like, some of their films have some very dated stuff. There is a scene in There's Something About Mary that I rewatched a few years ago, and I forgot it was completely in it. And because it was so shocking by today's standards, it had me laughing out loud just because it's the sort of thing that a lot of people would probably get offended by. If anyone's listening, you might know. I mean, that film is filled with a lot of like gross out humor sort of stuff. It's kind of
Yeah.
closer to the film that we'll be talking about next week. But going back to this one, I would go as far to say that this is their best film, and I think part of that is because it really reels itself in. It doesn't go too far over the line. And one thing, so this is a film that is so popular and, in my opinion, good, and it's like considered a classic at this point, that they have repeatedly tried to do sequels to this. And one thing, like, speaking of like this could have been more offensive but wasn't, is in the prequel, When Harry Met Lloyd, they had
I love that
the
titling.
right. Well, one thing, so it was about them meeting in high school and like becoming friends and stuff, and it has like a bunch of references to things they talked about in this movie. Like they meet that Felcher girl that Lloyd ends up like cheating with, like, on Harry and stuff. But one thing that film did that this film does not do, and I think wisely so, is that they had the stupid idea of having them actually be in special ed, like actually be like mentally
What?
handicapped, and it's like, that's not funny.
Yeah.
Like the point of this is not that they're like mentally handicapped or something. Like they're just dumb, like and just in kind of the sense of the word, like and from a comedy's perspective, like, if you meet someone in real life, uh you know someone might even know someone like this, where it's like they're not actually like, they don't have a learning disability, but like they just are like don't get things, or
they're just, basically they're always missing things.
Yeah, and the thing about all of the Farrelly Brothers films is that the comedy is slapstick based. And you can, in fact, one of their later films that I ended up seeing in theaters when it came out is they did a Three Stooges movie. And that is kind of what they're going for in most of their comedies. Like, that, it's very low brow, it's people getting hurt, it's very stupid jokes. Uh, but like this film, it never gets mean spirited, and I think that's still a strength going forward from this. I rewatching it, I'm seeing it. I'm like, some of the humor might be dated, but I don't really think there was anything in this one that's particularly offensive. The closest thing is just sort of Lloyd's obsession with Mary, but that's sort of the point of why it's so funny, is that she does not have any feelings for him, and he's just like, oh, you should have seen it, Harry. It was like a tractor beam. She's coming in for a hug. We fell for each other. It's like that could be considered maybe kind of problematic by today's standards, but that is sort of still the point that the movie had.
It's basically, it was an awkward thing to do. Even back then it was awkward. But
yeah,
the way I'm trying to look at it though was just like the intention was for comedy. It was not because it was supposed to make anyone uncomfortable. Which, I mean, I guess it was supposed to make you uncomfortable because you're supposed to laugh at how awkward this is. But basically it's like cringe comedy, I guess.
Kind of. And it's also like there's quite a few like quotable lines in this movie. That was something I wrote down, because there's quite a few interestingly fun facts I did not know about this. And one is that a lot of the very famous lines, I saw an interview with the Farrelly brothers to like research this, and apparently while they were making the film, New Line Cinema wanted them to cut out a lot of stuff because it was not getting a reaction from the audience. And they fought to keep it in. But like, for instance, one line in this movie that is still incredibly funny is near the end of the film, when he's like proclaiming his love for Mary, and it's like, is there any way in this wide world that I could ever be with a woman like you? And she's like trying to let him down easy. She's like, a 1 in a million chance. And then he's like, so you're telling me there's a chance?
Oh my god. And I cringed so hard at that, because I've used that line so many times. So you're telling, and I'm like, this is where it comes from. Oh god.
But it's just funny that was something that the studio wanted cut, just because it wasn't getting like a big laugh. And the things that were getting big laughs were kind of the dumber things in the movie, like, like when they get stuck together on the motorcycle because one of them pees their pants and stuff like that. Things like that, which are, still funny, but kind of like very, again, like for like a rowdy audience, I can imagine that it was getting a big reaction from them. But and that's not the moments that have stood the test of time so much. Like when people talk about how great this movie is, they're talking about kind of the silly lines and like things like that.
And I feel like that has to do with how our understanding in society of masculinity has changed. Because if you really think about a lot of like these 90s sort of guy comedies, they all kind of focus on like what I'd consider very juvenile humor. Because that's the stereotype of what, men are into. They're not, the idea is that, that's, they're not deep thinkers. This is what they do. And so I actually feel like the fact that there are certain scenes like you just talked about that maybe are kind of dated is basically because our understanding as a society of masculinity has evolved. Just saying. That's my, as Trixie Mattel would say, controversial yet brave thing to say.
Possibly. I don't know if really either of them are coded as being super masculine. They're kind of losers. Like, that's again kind of what makes them endearing, is that they're, their bad behavior is, when I say bad behavior, honestly, I kind of like Harry. He never really, like, the worst thing he ever says is like when he's talking about his relationship with Felcher, and it's like, oh, she said I never listened, but I don't know, I was like, I wasn't paying attention. It's like that's a bit of a sexist thing, but for most of the movie, he's actually kind of a decent guy, albeit pretty slow. Lloyd, on the other hand, is kind of a creep. Like,
well, no, what?
he's
Wait,
very.
what? I didn't mean they were masculine. I mean is like the types of movies that
Oh,
were
I know what you
made.
mean. Like the type of people that would, and I guess that's true. I don't know. It's there's a lot of really likable characters. I really like the FBI agent who's like pretending that she's like moving away to get away from her boyfriend. She's kind of a funny character. Um, the whole situation is really funny too. Like so one other thing I learned in the interview with the Farrelly brothers is what filmmakers inspired them. And one thing that this film kind of reminds me of, besides like things like the Three Stooges, is it reminds me of like screwball comedies from like the 30s, especially because a lot of them had like a road trip element to them.
Right.
And even kind of like retro things like Paper Moon that came out in the 60s, which also kind of was like a throwback to screwball comedies. But the Farrelly brothers, apparently, like their heroes before they became filmmakers were the Zucker brothers, who did films like Airplane and Top Secret and like the Police Squad movies.
Oh, Police Academy.
So no, Police Squad.
Police Squad.
It's the ones. It also had Leslie Nielsen in it. It was the series was called the Police Squad. I'm trying to Naked Gun. That's what it was.
Oh, Naked Gun. Okay.
Naked Gun.
Yeah,
Like they had a TV series that got canceled called the Police Squad, but the Naked Gun in parentheses in the titles was from the files of the Police Squad or whatever. So that's what they did. Which makes a lot of sense because those movies are also very like lowbrow, slapsticky kind of comedies. And then the other thing that both of them really liked growing up was the Andy Griffith Show.
Oh, yeah.
And so like they said like they wanted to make comedies as filmmakers, and one thing that they really wanted in their comedies was to have kind of a little bit of heart to them.
Yeah,
like
I can see that.
They
yeah.
wanted them to care. They wanted you to care about the characters, and which is interesting because I feel like that works in some of their movies and not in others. Like it's that keeping with that, I'll probably bring it up in our next review because it's kind of a I do like Harry and Lloyd. I don't know if I'll feel the same way in our next review, but that's it's very hard for me to articulate why they're likable because they're kind of losers. They do some really like they never do anything seriously harmful, but they're kind of
not intentionally.
On paper,
not
exactly.
intentionally.
But it does work, and it's kind of like you do sort of care about that. You like obviously Mary's not going to fall in love with Lloyd when he comes to bring the suitcase back, and also there's that element of dramatic irony where the audience knows that the suitcase is full of money, but they don't. But at the same time, you're kind of hoping that maybe they do improve their lives somewhat because they're living in a crappy apartment and they both have dead end jobs that they get fired from. So it does have that element of like sentimentality and like caring about the characters. And that was the other thing in the interview, not just like, having some heart to the story, but one thing that they kind of mentioned in the interview is with a lot of goofy comedies, like even the Zucker Brothers movies, when you don't take the story seriously, kind of by the third act, you don't really care what's happening. You're just there for the jokes. And they really wanted their movie's final act to be just as engaging as like a regular movie, sort of like you're on the edge of your seat wanting to know what happens to the characters instead of just tuning out and only laughing at the jokes.
Right.
And that's kind of a great example with this film because it's almost like if it wasn't for the goofy idiots trying to return a suitcase, it's sort of like a crime drama. You've got the kidnapped, what we find out later is a husband, and by the end of the film they're held at gunpoint in a hotel room and stuff. Like if it wasn't for Harry and Lloyd being in the movie, it would be a very different kind of movie.
Right.
And you don't know, like, because it's a comedy, they're not going to die probably, but when they're all tied up and the guy's pointing a gun at them, you do probably kind of wonder how they're going to get out of that.
I did kind of like though towards that ending part though. I thought the whole part about her, the woman he runs into at the gas station, being an FBI agent who was on their trail this whole time was hilarious. But it didn't feel like it came out of left field either.
No, it's actually because I've seen this movie a ton of times. I obviously, even when I've seen the movie, I'll rewatch it right before the review, just so I have it fresh in my mind. But it is fun going back and kind of rewatching and knowing that she's an FBI agent, kind of figuring out where she's planted in the story to like tail them, kind of, because it is after the big death of that one character at the hot sauce place.
Yeah.
That's when she's introduced, and that's when the FBI are introduced into the story. So again, if you go back, it's like, okay, so they know they're headed this way and stuff. So, you know, a few scenes later, she's at that gas station, and you kind of realize like, oh, okay, they knew where they were headed, and they planted her there to like kind of make contact with them or whatever. So that's interesting. It's also like there's a lot of variety of settings and stuff in this film too, because they start off in Rhode Island and they end up in Colorado, and because of that, you know, obviously it's because it's a road trip thing and stuff. Like you got a lot of different places that they go to. I guess my question is like, what did work for you, and what parts do you think aged poorly? Like, do you have any scenes in your mind?
I'm trying to think if there's any scenes in particular in my mind. Well, I do know there was one. Uh, I'm trying to think. The scene with Seabass at the truck stop. I don't think that aged well.
Sort of. I
Well,
was wondering if that would come up in this show. The reason I still think it works is because it's not like making fun of like a consensual hookup in a bathroom. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't feel like it's making fun of the LGBTQ community. It feels like Seabass is like a violent uh, sexual assaulter type rather than, because it didn't feel like, oh, he was there for like a casual
well,
hookup or anything like that. Definitely probably a little insensitive by today's standards,
well,
but if it was like
especially if
he
you
was
see the full scene, because what we see in the actual movie
oh,
is cut down.
okay. Shoot,
Uh,
I should have. It looks like you've done more research than me in that area. I don't think I've
well,
ever seen the deleted scene.
because I wanted to make sure I understood the scene, I just Googled, was Seabass gay? um, and so I found out the scene's actually longer.
Gotcha.
And well, first off, fun fact, because you know that's why I asked if they're from Boston. Seabass is played by Cam Neely of the Boston Bruins. Um,
Ah,
and so in the entire scene, um, we see him pull his pants down, revealing a leopard print thong. And then he grabs his crotch and tells Lloyd, "This is your happy place." So it's a little bit more explicit in the original
for sure.
script. And what I mean, and what I mean, first off, yes, it's better that it was a non-consensual thing. For I guess for actually, that sounds really bad the way I phrased that. It's better that I think they did cut it, and the fact that they framed it better as more of an anger assault,
Yes.
because I feel like what's supposed to be even more funny about that is that as we're supposed to think that Seabass is a bigger loser than they are. That he has to hook up with men and wear leopard print thongs. Basically, it's putting homosexuality on a lower plane than even these guys. And so that's why I think the fact they edited it works better, because it's less. I think it's less offensive that way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely. Well, and I'm sure they agree because they cut it out of the movie. That it works better that way. Partly, like again, the other reason I feel like this works so well is, and I consider it like a good classic comedy, is it
Mm-hmm.
stays right in that comfy PG-13 space.
I actually really did appreciate that because I was like, oh god, how because I to me there's like a sweet spot of comedy, at least for me, and it's usually right when it's in PG-13, but it sort of rides that rail.
Yeah,
It rides that rail of where it could have been R if they wanted to, but they didn't need to. Because and I think I've talked about this with you in movies before. It's like I've always been kind of like I don't necessarily usually like our movies much because I feel like it almost gives people too much freedom because I feel like the best things come about when you have some sort of constraint on you. If that makes sense. At least that's how I operate. It's like
I
when you have to operate
I
around certain things, it's where you get creative and the funnier things come about. Like I love the amount of slapstick there was in this movie. I did not expect for it to be as slapsticky as it was, and I love that.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I agree. I think in not even just in comedy, but in a lot of like famous films, a lot of the best things came from the restrictions they had, either technologically
Mm-hmm.
or with actor availability or with the script or whatever. Like anytime there's like problems on the set or you had to reel things in or like cut things out, it usually ends up being for the best. And that scene we were just talking about I think is a great example. And on top of that, when it's an R-rated comedy, I feel like there's very few R-rated comedies that age well where I go back to them and I like them as much as when they came out.
Right, because I feel like it
And I
just
feel
it just
like
goes into what's edgy right now, what is
exactly,
edgy.
it's less about trying to be like creative and it's more about like shock,
Yeah.
which isn't always a bad thing. Again, I'm gonna bring this up in our follow up review because I have quite a lot to say about that with the next film they did being R rated and a lot of the decisions they made there.
Mm-hmm.
Because when the downside to that is when you know the punchline, it's not as funny the second time.
Yeah.
A lot of the jokes in this movie are still funny when you know they're coming. In fact, I meant to make a joke about this when we started off this episode, but another really great scene is the piss drinking scene.
Oh yeah, that was so. I don't know.
It's such a great little thing, and again, it's not overly gross, it's not over the top, and it does not, it's the
yeah.
sort of thing even a kid could appreciate the scene for just being. And the setup and the payoff is still funny. Like he's peeing into the bottles because it's frantic. So Harry's doing a bad job driving. It looks like he might be a drunk driver, and then when he gets pulled over, he has like 5 beers in his hands.
Yeah.
So the cop thinks, again, like that is a type of scene that will still be funny on repeat viewings because there's setup and payoff, and even
Yeah.
when that cop is going to drink the piss.
Even yeah, as gross as it is, there's still something amusing about that. It's like seriously, you need to
It
drink
also
it to
helps
be
that
sure.
actor that played the cop was kind of a big comedian in the 90s, and I don't know what happened to him, but I wish he was in more stuff because he's got a very expressive face, and part of what sells that scene is after he drinks it, the like facial expression and
Yeah.
like ticking he's doing and stuff. It's like he's a key ingredient in what made that scene so funny.
My question
But
is,
there's
why did he swallow it? You did not need to swallow that. You should have realized right away what that was.
oh my god.
uh,
But that's the thing about that is it's part of what makes it funny. He also like swishes it around in his mouth. Also,
yeah.
it's kind of a punishment too, because right, he's like an on-duty cop, and like if that had been beer, it's like, oh, he's drinking on the job, so it's
Yeah.
almost like punishing him for being kind of a corrupt cop. So it's scenes like that are what really stand out to me. Or the other one, this one's a little more gross, but again, it's still funny, and it's not like overtly like they don't step over that line. It's when Lloyd poisons Harry with the laxatives, and then
Yeah.
uses the restroom, and then Mary's like, "Oh, the toilet doesn't flush."
Yeah, I feel like if that has gone into R-rated territory, they would have done something where we would have seen the excrement. I'm like, I don't need to see
Yeah, it
that.
like would have been spraying the walls or something. But
Yeah.
again, like part of why it's funny isn't just oh haha diarrhea. It's like that situation, like oh my god, the toilet won't flush, and now he's like frantically trying to fix it and stuff. It's
Well,
like
it kind of reminded me of a scene in another sort of kind of adulty comedy that I've enjoyed. I don't know if you ever saw it. It had Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston. It was called Along Came Polly. Uh,
oh, I you know what's funny is I thought you were about to say there's something about Mary, and then I was going to remind you that that was one of their future films because there is the very beginning of that movie. There's kind of a similar sort of situation that reminded me of this film, but no, I actually haven't seen Along Came
well,
Polly. But
there's a scene in it where Ben Stiller's character has Indian food, and of course, that upsets his stomach, and he's over at Polly's house, this girl that he's kind of courting, and so he's over there, and then he's squeezing the, and then she runs, and so we go in there and we find out that she has these towels in there that her grandmother embroidered or something, and then while he's in there he runs out of toilet paper so he uses the
oh,
towel, and then he tries to flush it, and luckily in that scene it just normal water comes out, but it kind of sort of reminded me it was a similar sort of situation. They could have made it grosser
yeah,
than needed to be. And so I kind of again, I did sort of appreciate that this movie did what you said. It wasn't trying to be gross out or shocky, because I feel like a lot of what I call bro comedies do that. And I
yeah, and that was kind of the thing. Again, last year when we were talking about Yes Man, you seemed to have this like idea that Jim Carrey was in like these films were quote unquote bro comedies. And although I would not be surprised to see a frat boy saying that this is his favorite movie of all time, I don't think it really like is the same energy as like I don't know, a
and you touched
like
on
a college comedy.
right, but and I think you touched on it earlier, and I think the fact is that this movie, it did have sort of a heart in it. The characters had some sort of moral compass. The people had feelings and emotions, and to me, and I think that's to me what kept it at least interesting, at least for me, because if it had just been kind of like just all bro comedy, I would have been like thumbs down now.
Yeah, and that's kind of because it's hard to really point at when I think of bro comedies, I think of like National Lampoon and stuff. But even then, you also have comedies like Vacation and stuff, which I wouldn't necessarily say is like a bro comedy. But when
Yeah,
I think of that subgenre, I think of like where all the jokes are based around like the boys getting drunk and like hitting on girls and stuff. And
yeah,
it's like that's not really any. Maybe we'll talk about more Jim Carrey films in the future, but like The Mask is sort of a superhero movie. Ace Ventura is sort of a crime investigation film. Like, but both of them have a comedic element that kind of capitalize on Jim Carrey's impressionist
hmm
talents and also the fact that he can contort his face into goofy things. The Mask is a really good example because his character is really into cartoons, and so this superhero alter ego is essentially like a walking cartoon. And then kind of the Ace Ventura I really enjoy, and that it's almost
that was
like a
almost my
goofy.
pick for this month. That was almost my pick for this month.
It's
Almost.
it's like almost a goofy CSI episode, but instead it's like animal related kidnapping. And what's funny about that film and why it's one of my favorites is because the joke is that he's good at his job. Like he's this weird guy, very eccentric, like he's constantly like bending over and talking out of his butt and stuff. But what makes it funny, and this is something that in screenwriting classes they talk about when you're writing for villains, is what people will like the character if they're good at what they do. And that's kind of, he's not a villain, but like it's kind of the same thing. You like Ace Ventura because he is like, if I lost my dog, he is exactly who I'd want to call because he will find my dog. He's actually good at his job. He's just a complete nutcase.
What was like
and it
what you talked about, his his faces are like what really sells Jim Carrey. And I don't know if you knew this, and again, I didn't do research on this all kind of popped up I did research sea bass because I was curious, but I watch a lot of these things on Amazon, and if you pause it on Amazon, they show you trivia on the side. So apparently, in this movie, Jim Carrey, the chip in his tooth was real.
I did not know that, but
he chipped his tooth a long time ago, and he had the cap removed for this movie.
That makes sense. That's also again, like we talked about this in Yes Man, but Jim Carrey is, despite my conflicting feelings on the guy, he is a talented guy. He will always put 100% into whatever film project he's working on. I should watch the Sonic movie because I'm pretty excited for the sequel that's coming out, and it looks like they're letting Jim Carrey go full crazy mode for that movie. But yeah, like there's, besides the chipped tooth, another thing that came up in my research is he did do quite a bit of improv in the movie. Like another really famous scene in this that people quote all the time is the, "Hey, want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?"
Yes. Okay.
That was improv. Yeah. That was not in the script. That was just Jim Carrey. They're shooting this thing like, "Hey, you're supposed to be annoying this gangster, like making him angry." So that was just him ad-libbing. And part of the reason you can tell is from Jeff Daniels' expression. He didn't know what Jim Carrey was going to do, so when he started crying like a baby, that's like his legitimate reaction because it's such a good joke. Like, what's the most annoying sound in the world?
I love what I love is the more I've watched these movies you've introduced me to, is I get a lot more when people reference things.
Yes.
And other things, like I showed you, and you weren't a fan of, but I showed you that channel Sam and Mickey with the Barbie dolls who are sassy.
Yeah.
And there's actually an episode where one of I think they're driving in the car and Barbie's like, "That's not annoying, this is annoying," and she does that same sound, and I'm like, oh my god, that was so obviously a reference.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's, if you hadn't seen this movie you wouldn't know, but again, like this it's still fairly well. God, I'm getting old because this isn't very recent. 1994 is like quite a few decades ago. But again, it's like when new films come out, it's kind of hard to really know if they're going to stand the test of time and be considered a classic, even if they were really popular when they came out. But again, it's like things like that, like that's timeless. Like that's funny no matter what year it is. In the year 2050, that'll still be funny because it's kind of true.
I just thought of something. You said none of the characters ever do anything intentionally to hurt anybody. Well, or do anything intentionally that will cause harm. What about...
Technically, Lloyd does.
Yeah, what about...
when he thinks Harry...
Well, that... And that's to me, that's different. That's within the character dynamic.
Yes.
But I just thought, Lloyd knowingly sells the dead bird to the blind kid.
Yes, he does.
So I will say that was an intentional act, and he did do that wrong.
Oh, I agree, and that's one where it's kind of funny because of how ridiculously mean and like evil that is. Like you're not laughing at the kid, you're laughing at you did that.
Well, I love that. I love how that was such a big enough thing that there was a national like news magazine covering that later.
But that's also like extra payoff. Like again, when I talk, because that's what it makes it even funnier because she's watching the news and it's like coming up at 10 the story of a young boy, and as you're hearing it you're like, wait a second, and you remember. Well, and it becomes funny because it's like, oh my god, they're still talking about that. Like,
then also they put that up against the story of the Menendez brothers. I was like, seriously?
Yes. Oh my god, no, that was funny. Oh man, there was
a lot to laugh at in this movie. I will say there was a lot to laugh at in this movie.
Well, going back to the scene you didn't like, and also going back to the point about this being pretty solidly, comfortably in PG-13, and somewhat, I don't think little kids should watch this, but this was one of those films that I was able to get my parents to let me watch before I turned 13.
Yeah.
And the jokes work, like, speaking of that scene we were talking earlier in the review, I didn't understand when I was a kid that it was like a homosexual encounter. I thought Seabass was just going to beat him up.
Well,
and that's also part of the reason why I kind of feel like that scene was tastefully done, even though it is a bit insensitive, is it's, you know, obviously if they kept the bit with him taking his pants off and stuff, it'd be a lot more obvious what he was doing.
Yeah.
But as a kid, I didn't get it. I just thought, oh, it's the guy that ripped me off earlier. I'm going to kill him.
Right.
So I wasn't really thinking like that.
There's certain scenes like that, like you just said, that when you watch when you're younger, you don't get, like we talked about previously in Down with Love, where I was like, that telephone scene, I'd seen that for like years, and it wasn't until like I had a break of like 5 years before I'd seen it, and I watched it in college, and I was like, oh my god. It's just you just don't get it.
Exactly. And I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten that if I saw that film at a young age.
I will say, though, with what they left in, though, the only thing that's really super insensitive about that is every character, for the most part, has sort of, not like an arc, but they have like a final sort of moment where, you know, they end up happy or not. Basically, essentially, the way that scene ends is that with what Seabass is doing, he is, and because he never shows up again, he will always be lower than these two losers. And to me, that's the only thing that's really sort of problematic about that scene, is it's kind of like his comeuppance is that he has to cruise for sex in truck stop bathrooms. Do you know what I mean?
For sure. And that's the thing too, where I'd argue, like, if they made it a bigger part of his character that he was homosexual, then I think that it would be a little less tasteful. But the reason he's lower than them to me is because he's a violent bully. Yeah. You know, like even taking out that scene, the bit in the diner where it's like, you know, he spits on their burger and stuff. He's just a jerk. Like and that's where, like, again, they don't really go too far into his sexuality.
Yeah.
So it, you know, like if they made it like a big joke that he was gay and like made it a big thing, like, oh,
right,
isn't it funny that he's gay? Then I find that way more offensive than just like...
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And if you really think about it, the fact that he just left this note there saying, whoever's here at 2:15 a.m., get ready for man love, you know, tells me,
oh my God.
It tells me that his character is just inherently a rapist.
Well, you know, one fun fact that I guarantee most of you listeners probably won't have known this, and I don't think you would know this, and it surprised me, is this is a Razzie-nominated film.
That doesn't surprise me.
So it was, well, this is what's surprising, considering how, in retrospect, this might seem kind of laughably bad, but like, so it was nominated for one Razzie, for Worst New Star for Jim Carrey.
He was a new star at the time?
This was like...
Oh, that's right.
Fact, this is a fun Jim Carrey tangent. So he's talked about this on talk shows and stuff, but Jim Carrey, I forget what year it was. It was probably like 93 or something. It was right before, because 94 and 95... his three biggest movies came out in the span of like a year. It was this, it was The Mask, and it was Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Mm-hmm. And so on the talk show, he said, like, before he was already acting, he had his stand-up career, and he was a regular cast member on In Living Color. And he was somewhere, and he went to see a psychic. And the psychic told him, like, that you are about to get incredibly famous. Like, the next, couple of projects you work on are going to make you one of the biggest stars in the world. And right after he saw that psychic, he got cast in Dumb and Dumber, The Mask, and Ace Ventura.
Wow.
So this might have been his first film. It was one of the three of them, but this might have been his feature debut. So... yeah, it's ironic that this is Razzie nominated, and the Razzie that it was nominated for was for Worst New Star for Jim Carrey.
Well, and I don't
retrospectively, it's shocking that they would think that.
Well, and I don't necessarily think that's a fair thing to say, because his characterization is just so odd that I just feel like anybody who would watch this would just assume he was not being portrayed correctly.
Here's where my mind is at, trying to rationalize why that would happen, is kind of every generation there's sort of a comedic actor that the general populace hates despite the fact that they're popular. I feel like Adam Sandler kind of got this too.
And now Pete Davidson gets that.
Yeah. Yeah, even though he's not really a film star, but still, yeah, like Pete Davidson gets that. But anyway, like, so
Adam
the
Sandler
reason
definitely got that.
so now, Jim Carrey's considered like an excellent actor, not just in
Yeah.
comedy, but he's been in stuff like I mentioned this, I think, in the Yes Man review, but like I really like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Yeah, he was
the
good in that,
Truman
yeah.
Show. Like outside of comedy, he's really proven himself as an excellent talent dramatically. But the thing is, like with these kind of characters he was playing, and also his comedic style, I called it overacting when we talked about Yes Man, but it's very like cartoony and over the top.
Yeah.
And at the time, it's funny to think of it this way because it's what made him famous. It's why he was cast as the Grinch. It's why they recently cast him as Dr. Robotnik, is because he's very cartoony in his comedic styling. But at the time, in the early 90s, he was considered very irritating. A lot of people found his characters very grating. And it's just funny because now he's kind of considered, even those films, like at the time they came out, like Ace Ventura and The Mask and stuff would be considered kind of like lowbrow, stupid comedies, including this.
Yeah.
Even though it was reviewed well, like I think Ebert and Siskel like gave it like 3 or 4 stars, so it was well reviewed at the time, but it was still considered like kind of like comedy for idiots, if that makes any sense.
You mean like how Inception is a deep movie for idiots? I'm just shots
right?
fired.
But it's funny because it's easy to forget that because I was aware of it partly because I still remember it from when I was a little kid, like people joking about Jim Carrey movies and stuff. But seeing that this was nominated for a Razzie really made me think like, what? And then I thought about it and I was like, I guess, yeah, like especially if this was his first movie and people only knew him from like The Fire Marshal and In Living Color, I'm sure there was probably like a groan from people being like, oh wow, this guy's gonna be a comedic star now. He's a movie star. He's not a movie star. I'm going back in time in my mind to 1994 and just thinking of how people probably really dismissed this performance, and it's just very interesting in retrospect. And I think most of our listeners probably did not know that's a thing. It certainly shocked me when I was looking at stuff.
Well, I mean, even Jeff Daniels went on to be a dramatic actor.
Oh, yeah. Well, he was actually a dramatic actor before this movie.
Oh, he was before?
I think, like... Oh, yeah. Like, he's just, like, an actor. Like, a character actor is what they call it, where you play characters, so you can do any genre. Like, another great example is John C. Reilly. Like, I really knew him from, like, Tim and Eric and a lot of stupid, jokey things that I watched. But before that, he was in Chicago. He was in The Lobster. He was in, like, all sorts of, like, dramatic stuff. But, like, I know him as Dr. Steve Brule or, like, the guy from Step Brothers. But, yeah, Jeff Daniels. And great, perfect example. Like, a lot of people who maybe are younger will recognize Jeff Daniels probably more for The Newsroom, which was a much more like dramatic HBO show.
That's where the face, because I knew there was something I could put the face with, and I was
exactly
trying to think what it was.
Yeah, he was the star of that, and so like if people aren't really into like dumb comedies, they'll probably recognize Jeff Daniels from that. And it's funny because he rarely plays stupid characters, so it's actually kind of funny to see him in this movie playing an idiot because most of the time he's playing very like serious dramatic roles. I watched this in school at one point, but he played George Washington in like a period piece.
I actually could see
and the whole time
his face would be perfect for that.
Yeah, well, he does kind of look like a young George Washington, but it was just funny. The whhole time I was watching it in class, I just couldn't get Dumb and Dumber out of my head, and it was blowing my mind that he was doing this. But yeah, so that was a really fun fact. Going back to that interview, trying to see if there's anything I missed out on here. Let's see. Andy Griffith. Oh, here's a neat quote from one of them in the interview. Like they were asked if, because this was their first film, if they were like nervous doing this or whatever. And one of the Farrelly brothers said, if you're starting a project and you're not scared, then you're not inspired. And I thought that was kind of neat.
I like that.
I like it too. It's funny because a lot of if I hadn't really watched an interview with either of them, before. The only time I'd ever seen their faces was, again, I went to see their Three Stooges movie when it came out. And at the end of the film, they did kind of a thing. I guess it was because that film was PG and was sort of intended for kids. But they did, at the end of the credits, like a whole thing like, hey, this is how we did the slapstick stuff. See, this hammer is made of rubber, and when you add a sound effect and stuff. And it's like, that's the only time before that I'd ever really seen them. But they've also directed stuff outside of comedies individually. And one thing, this is another fact that blew my mind, and maybe some of our listeners don't know this, but the Best Picture winner from a few years ago, Green Book, was directed by Peter Farrelly.
Really? Okay, now that I didn't know.
Yeah, right?
But isn't that like a super controversial movie?
It's controversial that it won. I don't think anyone hated it. I actually thought it looked like a neat story. If you aren't familiar, because I still haven't seen it, but if you aren't familiar, the story is that this rough like gangster type dude is hired to be the bodyguard for a pianist who's going on tour in the South, and he's black. So it's like this like tough guy Italian dude and this like black artist like touring through very racist parts of America and like kind of becoming close and whatever. Again, I haven't seen the film, but I thought it was an interesting kind of pairing. And the gangster dude was played, I think, by Viggo Mortensen, so that was like kind of a cool, role for him.
Yeah,
he likes to do. But yeah, so I remembered it was controversial because it won Best Picture, and a lot of people wanted. There were plenty of. It's one of those years where almost all of the other nominations would have probably suited better for Best Picture, but I don't think anyone hated the movie.
Well, no, I should remember there was some controversy around it. I was just realizing. I think Jeff Daniels was also just in the To Kill a Mockingbird play that came out a couple years ago. I think he was Atticus in that. I could be wrong though, but I think he was.
Dude, I hope so. That'd be, again, it's funny. He's very good in serious roles, but whenever you see him in anything outside of this, it's hard to forget that he was Harry. And then the other thing with Green Book, I think the other reason it's kind of controversial, I have not seen it, but from what I understand, it kind of has that white savior trope where it's like Viggo Mortensen's character is sort of the main character, even though the guy he's guarding is the one going through all of the drama.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a scene where he teaches the other guy how to make fried chicken, which I was like, seriously, you're gonna do that?
Well, anyway, but yeah. So Peter Farrelly directed that. I don't think he didn't write it because it was based on a book, so he didn't write that.
Well, he could have adapted it.
He could have. I didn't look too far into it.
That's not the movie we're talking about.
I think I was mostly just shocked that he directed that film. But yeah, lots of crazy things to
cycling back. I think one of the things I didn't like about it is I really liked kind of the road trip aspect of it, and I feel like it was cut off too soon. I feel like we got to Aspen too soon. Does that make sense?
I kind of know what you mean. Like, it's funny because I saw this and the film we're reviewing next time back to back, and one of my, I guess, spoiler for next episode, but one of my criticisms with that film is I felt like it went on for too long. And it's interesting because it is a road trip movie, but the road trip is only like a chunk of the movie. Like the first act is like essentially before they leave, so there's like a couple of hijinks in Rhode Island. Then the whole act 2 is essentially the road trip, and then the final act is when they're in Aspen and they're trying to get the suitcase to Mary. So it's like, it's one of those things where I kind of agree, but I also feel like if they had added anything else, it might have started to feel over long.
I feel like to me, I guess I felt like the road trip part was more interesting than whatever happened in Aspen. That's just how I just felt. To me, I thought the two of them together going along, and the fact that they were being pursued by these, I think they were like mafia people or something, or just
like
assassins.
The hired,
the hired people. I thought that was interesting, and so I didn't mind a little bit of time in Aspen, but I think there was still like 50 minutes of the movie takes place in Aspen, and I was just like, oh, well, I guess that's cool.
I think what made it, the difference, there's like a difference with every act too, because when they're in Rhode Island, it's like half of the first act is seeing them in their job and then getting fired and then like preparing for the trip, and yeah, it's essentially establishing their characters, where they live, their whole worm farming business that they're hoping to start, and kind of just how completely inept they are at doing the most simple tasks. Then Act Two, it's the road trip, and it's essentially kind of just a framework to put them in a bunch of different like goofy situations, because they're constantly traveling. Now they're in this setting and this setting and this setting, and I'd say Act Three, it kind of is just like, what would let's give these guys a bunch of money, because now they find out that the suitcase is full of money, and make it about like, what do stupid people spend money on,
right? Especially after they make
and
this whole big thing about, we're going to account for every, which they do, but when you phrase it like that, you think they're going to be at least somewhat responsible.
well, and it's kind of funny too. Like, I remember this, maybe it doesn't exist anymore, but I remember hearing like a news story about somewhere there's like a solid gold toilet that you can like pay to like use the restroom in, and it costs a lot of money. And it's such a stupid thing, but it's like that, it's that's the sort of thing I could see either of these guys wanting to do. And that's kind of what made Act 3 really funny to me, is like, again, it's like, okay, let's give them like $100 million. Now what would the two biggest idiots in the world spend all their money on? And like, another kind of iconic thing in the movie is their tuxedos at the nature event. I love their ski outfits that they buy that are super garish. I really love the pretty woman like montage of them getting ready for the ball. And the thing about Aspen too is it's like they're not there for that long. Just long enough to like, have a few laughs about things and move on. I do know what you mean though. Like the road trip at least kind of had a little bit more diversity to it. But the whole movie is almost just sort of, again, it really makes a lot of sense that they like the Three Stooges. Because, like, again, I didn't get this from the interview. I got this from when I saw it in theaters. They talked about how it was, one of their favorite things to watch as kids and stuff. And it really makes sense with this movie, because it's like the Two Stooges. It's like a whole movie of just, like, comedic set piece after comedic set piece. Just little, like, 10-minute scenes of them. Again, it's almost like a series of Stooge sketches.
Well,
what
I thought was interesting was, the movie did sort of play with your expectations, because at one point I thought they were going to end up with like each other's girl. You know what I mean? Because she hits it off with Harry, and then Lloyd, it's sort of kind of hits it off a little bit with FBI chick at the bar.
Somewhat. And then you kind of find out it's probably just because she needs to keep tabs on him. But I do know what you mean. And also that too, she seems to want to hit it off with him, and he's just like, ew, get away from me, where's Mary?
Yeah.
So technically Harry's kind of a ladies' man. He sort of hits it off with both of them. He would have gotten her number if it wasn't for the fact he caught his pants on fire.
Which I thought that was going to be a much worse scene. I thought there was an end with the car exploding or something, because he got that all over the ground too.
Nah, they didn't go that far. She again, in retrospect, again, like at the beginning of the review, I said it's kind of fun going back to this, because when she's an FBI agent, her behavior makes a little more sense. Because if you're watching this the first time, you might be like, what does she see in these guys?
Yeah.
But now it's like, oh, it's because she's trying to tail them. It's like, oh, hey, I'm going to flirt with these guys. Maybe I can see if they figure out who they are. Because at that point, the FBI didn't know if they were like other gangsters, or like they knew they had the money, but they didn't know why. So she was almost kind of doing like what the hired thugs were doing, but in a more like friendly, covert sort of way. She's just trying to find out who they are. So her flirting with them makes more sense in retrospect. But then again, it's like going back, it's like, well, she probably didn't actually have any interest in either of them. She was just doing her undercover thing.
There's and there's something that I'm actually surprised you haven't brought this up.
Ooh.
You haven't mentioned the hotel at all, and I wanted to see if you figured it out.
Well, so I saw when I was going through IMDb and getting like the budget and all of that sort of stuff. I did notice that one of the filming locations was the Stanley Hotel. So was it that Stanley Hotel from The
Yes,
Shining?
yes, the Stanley Hotel that inspired The Shining. Yes, that is where
That
they
is
filmed.
incredibly funny. I didn't know that it was. Well, you can shoot anywhere, but is the Stanley Hotel in Aspen?
It's in oh my god, I used to know exactly where it's at. It's in
That actually makes
Colorado.
sense. I remember Jim Carrey said he stayed at the Stanley Hotel and he had a really scary time. So I guess it must have been when he was shooting Dumb and Dumber.
It's in Estes Park, Colorado. Now I just need to find out how far that is from Aspen. But I recognized it immediately and I was like, let me see if Whiskey recognizes
Well,
this.
see, the reason I don't recognize it is because The Shining. I actually was talking to someone in my real life about this not too long ago. The Stanley Hotel is what inspired The Shining, but it was never featured in the film. The
Yeah,
Shining, the film, the shooting locations are two separate hotels, one for the exterior and one for the interior, but neither of the hotels in The Shining are haunted. They picked them, or Kubrick picked them because he thought they looked
cool.
interesting or scary or whatever, but neither of
Which
the
that's
shooting
always been
locations
my
in The
problem
Shining
with The
film.
Shining. I always thought The Shining looked cool. It has great lines. I never thought The Shining was scary. To me, it just looks cool. That's always kind of been like when people are like The Shining's one of the great horror films. I'm like, but why though?
We
Like,
can review it at a different time, but that's
I
kind of
mean,
the
The
I
Shine
will say
there
that
was
that's a Kubrick film in a nutshell. Is it looks cool, and I think that's why I like Kubrick films because as our listeners know, I'm a big cinematography nerd.
well,
So
and
the fact
also
that all of his films look cool.
well, and I think that's the reason why I like most of Baz Luhrmann's film is because they look cool too, but for different
Well, and they're very
reasons.
flashy and opulent,
Well,
and
not they're not always flashy and opulent, but they are always what I call
most of
feast for the eyes. There's a lot of stuff attention paid to how the buildings look, not necessarily the cinematography, but like in the set design, in the production design, in the coloring, and there's a lot of work that's put into them. And I think that's one of the reasons I appreciate it. But the Stanley Hotel was featured in the remake of The Shining that Stephen King. I know he wrote it. I don't know if he directed it. He may have directed it, but
No,
there's what
he famously did not like the Kubrick film. So
I don't
of
blame
course he
him.
wrote it. He wrote the book. You silly goose.
Well,
But no,
obviously,
he basically like gave. It's more faithful to his book, and it was a TV miniseries, and so that one's called Stephen King's The Shining. Is kind of a, but
but did he direct
but
it?
yeah, no, he didn't.
Okay.
He's fun fact, and maybe we'll review this in the future. But he actually worked with oh my goodness, what's it? I'm blanking on this. The guy who did the Night of the Living Dead for a film called Creep Show, and he co-wrote it, and he also actually starred in it a little bit. Stephen King, I know he wrote it, but I think he did direct it too. There is a really stupid film from the '80s about inanimate objects like electronic things coming to life and attacking people.
George
And
Romero.
thank you, George Romero. So him and Stephen King did Creepshow. But anyway, I think it was called Overdrive or something. But that's the film that I believe Stephen King directed, and it's terrible. Like and Stephen King, like he's very candid about the fact he really loves like trashy, stupid horror movies.
Mhm.
Like he never really aspires to be like a great artist or anything like that. He loves dumb, self-indulgent crap.
You can only say that after you're already accepted as a great artist. Like
Well,
seriously.
he also said like if he was not being published that he would continue to write. Like he doesn't care. He would just write books and like print them out and keep them in his closet or something. Like he literally is addicted to writing. Like he doesn't care. If they stop publishing his books, he'll just keep writing books and no one will ever see them.
You
And
know
he
what's
just will
funny?
do it for fun.
I had an old roommate, you'll probably agree with him, but we argued over this one. He's a huge Stephen King fan. And I said, he owes his first wife a lot. Like, he should give her proceeds and stuff from at least his first book. My friend was like, why? Because she's the one that pulled his manuscript out of the trash that he threw away, that he ended up getting published, and everyone loved it. Like, he owes so much to her. And he was like, but
No,
why,
I kind
though?
of agree with you. That's actually that's a sweet story, actually. That's actually very romantic.
She pulled out, she was like,
It's
yeah,
sad...
this is kind of good. You should, like, do something with this.
It's sad that they broke up then. That's actually very sweet.
That's fine, but I mean, like, I know, like, Richard, but I mean, at least, I'm like, she pulled your stuff out of the trash. She read it, said it was good. You should publish it. You should at least give all your proceeds from at least that book to her or something like that. Like, gotcha. I hope she got a lot in the divorce is basically what I'm trying to say.
But yes, going back to the original point we were talking about, yes, I did notice that, but I didn't know if it was the same Stanley Hotel. So that's actually really interesting. And again, it makes sense because I remembered hearing Jim Carrey talk about, like, he stayed there one time, and now it makes sense. He was there for Dumb and Dumber.
Yeah. I don't know if the interior room was one of the rooms, but definitely the staircase, definitely the lobby, the staircase, and the exterior was, in that hotel. And I also want to point this out to you. I'm a big Moonlighting fan. Bruce Willis's character in the show, David, he has a brother named, now I can't even think of what his name is. Was it Richard? I think it might have been, it's Richard. His brother's name was Richard. He was played by Charles Rocket. And Charles Rocket was the guy who was running the whole kidnapping scheme or whatever in this movie. So I was like, oh, it's David's brother.
That's funny, actually, because I was thinking, like, the guy who dies of the spicy chili, he's a famous actor, and I know I've seen him in other things. But I was thinking that about the guy who kidnapped the husband is like, this guy looks like he could have been a big star at the time. I don't know who he is, but that does not surprise me that he played.
His name was Mike Starr, though, the guy you're talking about. I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, Mike Starr, I believe, is who I'm talking about. But yeah, that's funny.
I will say he was pretty funny in this movie too. That guy. Actually, now that I bring up everything that's brought up as sort of kind of an offhanded comment comes back to something in the movie. Like the fact he's going, I have this ulcer the whole movie. And that ends up being a huge thing later, which is why he ends up getting poisoned. There was something...
Like I said, they're very attentive to details. Like we were talking about, like the blind boy earlier. Yeah, how that comes back in like kind of a funny joke where he's being featured on like Dateline or something.
Even Seabass coming back. It's like the movie is very. To me, it's kind of like if you think about like when you tie up a package, it's tied very tightly. Everything connects back to something, and that's something I could also appreciate.
Well, it also, like, going to, like, screenwriting, they have that, I forget if it's Antonov's gun. There was a famous Russian playwright, and he said, like, if you feature a gun in the first act of your play, then you need to fire that gun off by the end of the play. And that's essentially, like, kind of the whole mindset behind setup and payoff, like, not to waste anything.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a gun. It's just like if you set up that this character has an ulcer, that needs to play in somewhere else, or else it's useless. It doesn't belong in the film.
See,
and there's tons of that in this.
I understand Antonov's gun, but I also don't like that concept because to me it makes movies too predictable.
Possibly, but there is an art to, because when that idea has been done really well for me is when enough time has passed that you forget the gun is there.
Yes, that's true too.
Because then when it comes back, you have that, oh, that's right kind of like moment. And again, that's kind of the perfect example of that for me is the kid being on the news, because that was at the beginning of the movie, and then near the end of the movie, they bring it back. Yeah. And enough time has passed that you have completely forgotten about the blind kid and the bird. And so when they're talking, doing a big expose story on, these monsters that sold this dead bird to a blind kid, you laugh again because it feels new.
Yeah,
And
it does.
because
And I will agree with you on that. That is true. When it does, enough time has passed, but I feel like a lot of people they use Antonov's gun and they use it too early, if that makes sense.
I love how, again, I might be wrong about the name of the playwright, so I love how you've said it. So I might not be Antonov. Anyone who's listening to this, who's like screaming at us, like, or me, that it's not Antonov. I know, I forgot. This is a show where we drink while we're talking.
That's
so
true
I don't
too,
know.
but I am now calling it Zhivago's gun because I'm looking at my vinyl album of Dr. Zhivago. So it is now Zhivago's gun. Deal with it.
I'm going to make a mental note to look up the actual name of that playwright so we can correct ourselves in the next episode. With all the time that we've been talking and everything, I guess we're kind of at the end of this discussion. To me, I really think this is up there with, like, when you consider, like, quote unquote comedy classics, like, modern times with Charlie Chaplin to, like, in the 70s, like Tootsie and stuff like that. Things that are considered, like, comedies that are, like,
I just realized
stood the test of time.
Okay, I know where I recognize the bodyguard from. Not the bodyguard, the assassin guy from that I said was really funny. He was, ironically, Whitney Houston's bodyguard in the movie Bodyguard. He was her original one before Kevin Costner comes in and is like, y'all are idiots, fix this.
Oh boy.
I was like, he looks familiar, but now I know why he looks familiar. But yes,
I honestly have a feeling he probably just played a lot of, like, Italian gangsters in the 90s.
I feel like he played a lot of tough guy roles, you know what I mean?
I could imagine him slurping down, eating some gabagool, maybe painting some walls.
He was
painting some houses, as they say.
Oh my god! Okay, thank you. He was also in as this he was an Uncle Buck, like, back in the day as a clown. That's kind of funny. Anyway, so as we draw to a close here in our magical land of whiskey and sweet tea.
Magic.
I mean, I'm magical.
No, well, I guess we'll start off with you, because I've been pretty transparent about my feelings. What would you rate this film? How many pitchers of sweet tea out of 4?
I would give this a 6.5. Oh, I'm sorry. Out of 4, excuse me. I would give this a 2.5.
I figured we'd do, like, a parody of the Siskel and Ebert 4-star thing.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Maybe. That makes sense. Okay, out of 4 pitchers of sweet tea, I would give this a 2.5 because it's a solid movie. It's just and I think you've said this before about a movie that I think you said this before about Airport. It's a movie that you have to like this specific type of humor to really, get into it. And it's like I have to know the right person to recommend it to. And for me, it's not really my type of humor, but I could see how I could kind of see how it sort of became a classic. I can understand how fans of this would like this. And it's not a bad movie. I will say the ending was kind of a letdown. I'm like, seriously, they just end up kind of back where they started? That's disappointing.
It's very reminiscent of the Three Stooges. They never really improve over time, which I guess could be frustrating. Like, we talk about, like, character arcs and stuff, and they don't really have one. But again, it's kind of the point.
They have an adventure arc, but not a character arc.
Exactly. They don't change as people by the end of the movie. I would give this...
I didn't expect them to become smart or anything. I just thought they would, have money or a stable job or something.
No, I know what you mean. It's actually it's honestly, I do feel bad that the FBI confiscated all of their stuff. Right. I understand why, because it's evidence, because technically the money wasn't theirs. But I know what you mean. It would have been nice if, I don't know, even if, like, maybe Harry started dating the FBI agent or something. Anything.
Yes,
but
some
again,
sort of change in their lives. Some sort of
exactly.
change.
It's just very reminiscent of those, like, old slapstick screwball comedies where, like,
right.
It's more about, like, the characters being in a situation. Again, like, not to... Well, yeah, no, I will compare this to Charlie Chaplin because it's kind of the same deal. It's like the tramp never isn't a tramp, He's a tramp at the beginning, middle, and end of the movie, and it's about him, being in a situation.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same with these guys. I would rate this a 3 out of 4 bottles of piss, because I get where you're coming from, but I feel like the best parts of this movie, the comedy is pretty universal. You know what maybe lowbrow humor isn't for everybody, but I do think, a corrupt cop drinking a bottle of piss is going to make most people laugh. 9 out of 10 dentists will laugh at a cop drinking piss.
If you don't vomit from grossness beforehand.
Possibly. Or even like that line, like it may, so there's a chance, or like the most annoying sound in the world. Like these are the sort of things I feel like most people will find funny, even if you're not like really into like kind of, like I said, like lowbrow sort of like comedies like this. And I do think it is aged well. Like, unlike a lot of other Farrelly Brothers films, I feel like this one, it's honestly amazing this was their first film. I did not know that going into this. So the fact that this was the first Farrelly Brothers film, or Farrelly, I think I've been mispronouncing that.
I like Flying Farrelly. I like Flying Farrelly.
Flying Farrelly Brothers films. Triple F, as we'll call it.
The Triple F films.
As far as the Triple F genre goes, I feel like this is their best film, and it's crazy that it was their first film, but it also explains why they kind of dominated the 90s. Like, as far as like mainstream Hollywood comedies coming out, it was always an event when a new Farrelly Brothers film came out. Again, like, There's Something About Mary is another one where it's just like, I think that one was even nominated for some awards. And retrospectively, some things about it have not aged well. But I think for most people it would get a laugh out of them. That also reminds me, I said this at the beginning too, but I don't know if you've seen Shallow Hal, but I think you'd enjoy that one quite a bit.
Well, and I also want to clarify, when I say the humor's dated, I don't mean like it's offensive now. I mean, for the most part, I feel like humor styles have evolved. Like this is like this is very 90s style humor. That's what I mean by dated. I don't mean it's offensive.
I get what you mean. Well, and it's even a marketing point now. Like, we talked about this with Yes Man, where it was very similar to Liar Liar, which was another Jim Carrey comedy from the 90s. And it's almost like a marketing point at this stage in time, where it's like, oh, it's just like this movie from your childhood. Because, and that actually, like, we never talked. Dumb and Dumber 2 sucks, by the way, if anyone cares what my opinion of that is. And if you hate us, you can recommend that we review it. I saw it in theaters because I was hopeful, but my God, is it bad. And a big thing with that movie was it was really trying to cash in on the nostalgia, like, oh, this is going to be just as good as Dumb and Dumber. It's like, but it doesn't work. Enough time has passed that you really can't just like take the characters and make it work the same way.
And I will say, I think this movie, because it's one of Jim Carrey's first roles, I do think he doesn't lean too much on his weird face thing, because I feel like especially like we saw with Yes Man, he leans into that too much when he doesn't need to. And I'm like, dude, I've seen more of your top row of teeth in a lifetime than I should have to.
Right. Well, I talked about this in the Yes Man review, but my biggest complaint or criticism with his casting is that it didn't need to be Jim Carrey. Mm-hmm. Like, he did his whole like goofy guy shtick with all of his goofy faces and stuff, but like, if you were just to read the script, it's like you'd probably cast like some generic dude to be that character. Especially since like that character was really introverted and stuff. It's like, why would it be Jim Carrey? It doesn't play to any of it. This, and I talked about it, again, we couldn't really talk about it because you haven't seen a lot of Jim Carrey movies. But in that review, I said that movie does not play to his strengths. Yeah. This is a movie that plays to his strengths. It doesn't necessarily need him to make goofy faces, but he's very good at being over the top. And yes. Again, like, it's you can get really creative when it's like you're playing a stupid person. What does that mean to you? And not mentally challenged, but stupid.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of creativity you can put into that, because what is a stupid person? Like, truly stupid. And that's where Jim Carrey, I think, he played it really well, because his version of what a stupid person is pretty funny.
I'm kind of sad they had to leave their car behind, because that was a pretty iconic car.
It's a pretty cool car. I guarantee there's probably some dude bros from the 90s that
have recreated it somewhere.
Recreated the car. But anyway, glad you didn't completely hate it.
I did enjoy it. I was not like I wasn't like. And I will say this before. It's not like when I watched The Irishman and I was like, I want 4 hours of my life back. It was just, it wasn't my cup of tea, but I could see why it was so popular and why people to this day still enjoy it, even if I didn't particularly enjoy it, if that makes sense.
I gotcha. Well, anyway, thank you everyone for listening to us. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to like and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you're watching this on any of the other podcast platforms we're on, feel free to check out any of our older reviews. We've got a whole backlog.
Yes, he did just say if you're watching us on other podcast platforms. I mean...
Fine. If you're listening to us.
Thank you.
If you are listening to us. But anywho, tune in next week, or roll on with us, as a little hint, at the next Farrelly Brothers review, this one picked by T.
Yes.
And until next time, fun fact, I did not prepare my outro quip for this week.
I did, because you gave me a great idea. Make something up. Go ahead.
Just make something up. Let's see. Keep on sipping with us. I don't know.
That was so
what's
lame.
Your pick for? So it was lame. I'm gonna have to meditate on for next week. What's your pick?
My pick for ending night is Stay Strong, Ukraine, and as always, suck it, Scorsese.
See you guys next time. Thanks for listening.
Bye. Reels on the Rocks is a production of La Prince Laboratories. It is edited and produced by Alejandro Castillo and features original artwork by Asa Esparza and original music by Pat Mars. Follow us on Twitter at Reels on the Rocks and tweet at us with any movies or topics you'd like us to discuss in the future.